April 1945. The war in Germany was ending, but the silence felt unfamiliar. In a small town in Bavaria, the church still stood. Its stone walls were blackened by smoke. Several windows were shattered. The bell tower leaned slightly, but it had survived the bombing. On that Sunday morning, the bells rang again for the first time since American forces entered the town days earlier. German women gathered outside the entrance. Many wore dark coats that hung loosely from months of rationing. Some clutched prayer books. Others held children by the hand. Their expressions were guarded. They had heard stories repeated for years by Nazi propaganda, about what would happen when the Americans arrived. Across the square, 2 U.S. Army jeeps were parked. A handful of American soldiers stood nearby, helmets resting under their arms. One of them, a chaplain, spoke quietly with the town's priest. Then something unexpected happened. An invitation was extended. For a moment, no one moved. The women hesitated, unsure whether this was occupation or something else entirely. The church doors remained open. By April 1945, the Third Reich was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting for time. American forces had crossed the Rhine in March. The Remagen bridgehead had accelerated the Allied advance into Western Germany. Cities fell in rapid succession: Cologne, Frankfurt, Kassel, Würzburg. By mid-April, U.S. Army divisions were pushing deep into Bavaria and central Germany, linking with Soviet forces advancing from the east. The German military structure was collapsing. Entire units surrendered without coordinated resistance. Supply lines disintegrated. Communications failed. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler would take his own life in Berlin. But even before that, for civilians in the Western zones, the war had already ended in practice. For German women, the arrival of American troops carried a specific and deeply conditioned fear. For years, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry had warned that Allied occupation would bring humiliation, violence, and moral ruin. Posters, radio broadcasts, and newspapers described American soldiers as undisciplined, vengeful, and racially chaotic. Particular emphasis was placed on fear for women. The message was simple: surrender meant dishonor. By the spring of 1945, millions of German men were dead, missing, or held as prisoners of war. Cities were filled with women, children, and elderly civilians. In many towns, women were now the visible face of Germany's civilian population. They stood in ration lines. They cleared rubble. They negotiated with advancing troops. They opened doors when soldiers knocked. The American army that entered Western Germany was not unprepared for these fears. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower had issued clear occupation directives. Soldiers were instructed to maintain discipline and avoid revenge behavior. The objective was military defeat of Nazism, not collective punishment of civilians. Yet the policy that shaped early encounters was strict non-fraternization. Issued in September 1944 and reinforced in early 1945, the policy forbade American soldiers from engaging in friendly interaction with German civilians. No handshakes, no shared meals, no social visits. The reasoning was political and psychological. Germany had waged aggressive war. The population, Allied leadership believed, must understand defeat. Familiarity could blur responsibility. For German women, this created a confusing atmosphere. American soldiers behaved in structured, restrained ways. They posted guards. They requisitioned buildings. They enforced curfews. But they did not match the monstrous image that propaganda had described. In town after town, occupation followed a similar pattern. American troops would secure key infrastructure: rail stations, government offices, communication centers. Nazi officials were arrested. Swastika flags were removed. Weapons were collected. A military governor was appointed. Then came the humanitarian reality. Germany's transportation network had collapsed. Food distribution was erratic. Urban populations faced near starvation. In some areas, caloric intake dropped below 1,000 calories per day. Women walked for miles to barter possessions for potatoes or bread. Children showed signs of malnutrition. The American army had to confront an uncomfortable truth: stabilizing Germany required preventing famine. Military government units began organizing emergency food distribution. Churches, Catholic and Protestant alike, quickly became central to this effort. Many church buildings had survived bombing better than municipal offices. Clergy remained in place. They possessed local trust networks. In April and May 1945, American officers increasingly found themselves coordinating with German priests and pastors, not out of sentiment, but necessity. For German women, churches were among the few remaining structures of familiarity. Political authority had vanished. The Nazi Party was collapsing, but Sunday service still represented continuity. Yet even there, uncertainty lingered. Would American soldiers enter sacred spaces? Would services be restricted? Would clergy be removed under denazification measures? No one knew the rules of this new reality. Across the American zone, small but significant moments began to occur. Army chaplains, both Protestant ministers and Catholic priests in uniform, were assigned not only to American troops, but also to assist in stabilizing religious life in occupied areas. Their mandate was cautious. They were officers first, clergy second. Still, the sight itself carried meaning. An American officer wearing a cross or a crucifix on his uniform. 4 German women standing in bomb town squares. This image contradicted everything they had been told. Occupation had begun as a military fact, but beneath it, a quieter question was forming. If the war was truly over, what would peace look like? And in the weeks that followed, that question would move from the streets into the churches themselves. On May 7th, 1945, Germany signed the Instrument of Unconditional Surrender in Reims. The following day, victory in Europe was declared. For American forces in the Western occupation zones, the mission shifted immediately from combat operations to governance. The U.S. Army now administered millions of civilians across Bavaria, Hesse, Württemberg-Baden, and parts of the Rhineland. Military government detachments were assigned to cities and rural districts. Their responsibilities were extensive: restore utilities, oversee denazification, prevent disease, stabilize food supply, and enforce occupation policy. Among those policies, non-fraternization remained officially in place. American soldiers were still prohibited from social contact with German civilians. The order reflected Allied leadership's concern that premature normalization could weaken the political message of defeat. Germany, they believed, had to confront the consequences of its actions before reconciliation could begin. But enforcement on the ground was complex. American troops were now stationed in towns where daily survival required coordination with local populations. Soldiers relied on German labor for rebuilding infrastructure. Interpreters were needed. Farmers were essential to food production. Hospitals required staff. Women especially fill these roles. Simultaneously, report from the field began reaching higher command. Chaplains and civil affairs officers noted that religious institutions were among the few functioning community centers capable of organizing food kitchens, refugee assistance, and burial services. The war had displaced millions. By the summer of 1945, Germany contained an estimated 7 to 8 million displaced persons, former forced laborers, concentration camp survivors, refugees fleeing the Eastern Front. Many were housed temporarily in camps administered by the Allies. German civilians, particularly women, were tasked with cleaning streets, repairing homes, and caring for children amid this upheaval. Churches became logistical hubs. American Army chaplains were uniquely positioned within this environment. They operated under military authority, but shared theological language with local clergy. In many towns, the first structured meeting between Americans and German civilians occurred not in a government office, but inside a church sanctuary. The meetings were not initially symbolic gestures of unity. They were administrative. Coordination of food distribution, scheduling of services under curfew restrictions, ensuring that sermons avoided political content, verifying that clergy were not active supporters of National Socialism. Yet the visual effect was undeniable. American officers sitting beside German priests, German women watching carefully from wooden pews. In June and July 1945, occupation reports began to reflect a subtle change in tone. Instances of spontaneous conversation between American soldiers and German civilians were increasing. Soldiers shared cigarettes. Some offered chocolate to children. These interactions technically violated policy, but enforcement varied by command. By September 1945, after months of evaluation, the U.S. Army officially relaxed the non-fraternization order. Soldiers were now permitted limited social contact, though marriage and intimate relationships still required authorization. The policy shift acknowledged a practical reality. Total separation was unsustainable. For German women, this adjustment carried emotional weight. Many had spent years under a regime that equated foreign contact with betrayal. Now, cautiously, structured interaction was becoming permitted. The transition did not erase suspicion. In some regions, tensions persisted. Food shortages remained severe through the winter of 1945 to 46. Housing was scarce. Black markets flourished. But religious gatherings provided one of the first visible arenas where coexistence could be observed publicly. Sunday services resumed across the American zone. Attendance was high. War widows filled the pews. Mothers brought children who had known nothing but air raid sirens. Clergy preached themes of repentance, endurance, and reconstruction. In certain towns, American chaplains were invited to observe services. In others, German congregations were invited to attend joint Thanksgiving ceremonies organized by occupation authorities later that year. These events were carefully structured, sometimes translated line by line. There were no grand speeches of forgiveness. There were no declarations of instant unity. There were simply shared spaces. For German women who had expected humiliation or exclusion, the act of being invited, formally, visibly, into a service where American uniforms were present felt unfamiliar. Not because occupation had softened, but because it had not matched the catastrophic imagery they had been prepared for. The churches did not erase defeat. The rubble outside remained. Prisoners of war were still being processed. Denazification tribunals were beginning their hearings. Entire communities faced uncertainty about the future. But inside those sanctuaries, something subtle was occurring. The enemy was no longer faceless. And that shift would open the door to deeper transformations, human, political, and psychological, that extended far beyond a single Sunday morning. In the final months of the war, fear among German women was not abstract. It was reinforced daily. Nazi propaganda had warned that Allied soldiers would bring chaos. Particular attention had been given to stories, often exaggerated or fabricated, describing atrocities committed by enemy forces. As the Red Army advanced through eastern Germany in early 1945, confirmed cases of mass violence and assault-fueled terror across the country. These events were used by the regime to intensify panic in the West, implying that all occupying armies would behave the same way. By the time American units crossed into central and southern Germany, many women expected the worst. Some fled ahead of advancing forces. Others hid valuables. Families avoided eye contact when patrols entered town squares. Diaries from the period reveal a common pattern: surprise at discipline. American soldiers posted guards at intersections. They issued written orders. They paid for certain goods with occupation currency vouchers. They enforced curfews but did not ransack homes indiscriminately. This contrast created confusion. Women who had prepared for brutality encountered structure. Those who had anticipated humiliation experienced bureaucratic oversight instead. Fear did not disappear overnight, but it no longer aligned with reality. When invitations to attend church services alongside American personnel were extended in certain towns, disbelief was rooted in this psychological shift. The invitation did not erase suspicion. It challenged it. To step into a church where uniformed American soldiers stood respectfully required a recalibration of expectation. And that recalibration took time. For 12 years, the Nazi state had controlled information with precision. Radio broadcasts, newspapers, film reels, school curricula. Each reinforced a worldview in which Germany stood encircled by enemies defined as morally inferior or culturally corrupt. By 1945, that system disintegrated almost overnight. When American forces entered towns across Bavaria, Hesse, and the Rhineland, the loudspeakers fell silent. Nazi banners disappeared. Local officials either fled or were arrested. The sudden absence of propaganda created a vacuum. Into that vacuum came lived experience. German women who had been told to expect chaos encountered military police enforcing order. Those who had heard that churches would be desecrated watched as American soldiers removed their helmets before entering sanctuaries. Women who had been warned of mass reprisals observed structured food distribution supervised by occupation authorities. This did not produce instant admiration. It produced cognitive dissonance. Diaries from 1945 reflect this shift in tone. Writers often describe the Americans as correct or disciplined. Surprise is a recurring word. In some entries, women noted that soldiers smiled at children or handed out rations without insult. The invitation to attend a service where Americans were present fit into this broader unraveling of expectation. The psychological mechanism was subtle but powerful. Propaganda functions by predicting behavior. When reality contradicts those predictions consistently, authority erodes. The collapse of the Nazi regime was not only territorial. It was perceptual. For many German civilians, especially women who bore daily responsibility for families, practical stability mattered more than ideology. If the occupying force allowed church bells to ring, if it did not forbid prayer, if it coordinated aid rather than confiscating it arbitrarily, then the narrative of absolute enmity began to fracture. Religious gatherings became living evidence that total destruction of cultural identity was not the objective of occupation, and that realization carried consequences beyond theology. The demographic reality of 1945 Germany shaped the nature of early interactions. An estimated 5 million German soldiers were prisoners of war by the end of the conflict. Hundreds of thousands more were dead or missing. In many towns, the adult male population had been drastically reduced. The visible civilian population consisted largely of women, children, and the elderly. Women managed farms. They cleared rubble, earning the later name Trümmerfrauen, or rubble women. They stood in ration queues. They interacted with occupation officials over housing assignments and food distribution. Because of this, women became the primary civilian point of contact. American occupation authorities, aware of the risk of disorder, initially enforced strict codes of conduct to prevent exploitation or resentment. Yet, daily administration required communication. Female civilians approached checkpoints to request travel permits. They spoke with medical officers about vaccinations. They attended town meetings organized by military government units. Church attendance amplified this dynamic. Women were often more consistent participants in religious services than men even before the war. In 1945, with male clergy still in place but congregations heavily female, sanctuaries became visibly shaped by women's presence. When American chaplains entered these spaces, they were not addressing a mixed civic assembly. They were addressing mothers, widows, daughters. The emotional tone of these gatherings differed from battlefield ceremonies. There were no victory banners, no celebratory music. Instead, there were subdued hymns and sermons centered on survival, loss, and rebuilding. 4 German women, being invited, rather than summoned, into shared worship signaled a shift from enemy subject to civilian participant. This distinction mattered. Occupation law remained firm. Germany was divided into zones. Curfews continued. But within the church setting, interaction was framed not as command, but as coexistence. Over time, these repeated encounters built familiarity. By late 1945 and into 1946, marriages between American servicemen and German women began to increase, particularly after restrictions were eased. Between 1945 and 1950, tens of thousands of such marriages were officially recorded in the American zone. Each required bureaucratic approval, background checks, and military authorization. These relationships did not arise from a single church invitation. They developed from sustained proximity. But the early religious gatherings had helped normalize presence. The shift was incremental, from silence to observation to cautious acknowledgement, and eventually to conversation. The events of 1945 were not yet reconciliation. They were stabilization. Germany remained devastated. Infrastructure was shattered. Millions were displaced. The Nuremberg trials would begin in November 1945, confronting the world with evidence of systematic atrocity. Denazification courts processed thousands of cases. Food shortages persisted through the harsh winter of 1946 to 47. Yet even as legal reckoning unfolded, another process advanced quietly. The American occupation authorities began implementing policies aimed at democratization. Local councils were re-established under supervision. Independent newspapers were licensed. Political parties were gradually permitted to reorganize, provided they rejected extremist ideology. Religious institutions were encouraged to operate freely within constitutional limits. This freedom contrasted sharply with the totalitarian oversight of the previous regime. 4 German women attending church services in the presence of American personnel, the experience symbolized more than tolerance. It suggested a model of civic life not controlled by a single-party apparatus. By 1947, with the introduction of the Marshall Plan, economic recovery programs reinforced this transformation. American aid flowed into the Western zones. Reconstruction accelerated. Public perception shifted further as living conditions slowly improved. Looking back from the vantage point of later decades, particularly after West Germany joined NATO in 1955, the early occupation years appear as a foundational phase. Reconciliation did not begin with treaties. It began in shared spaces. In bombed sanctuaries where uniforms and civilian coats stood side by side. In invitations extended cautiously, then accepted hesitantly. Moments small enough to be overlooked in official reports, but significant enough to alter perception. And it was within one of those moments that the broader transformation would crystallize. For American troops, Germany in 1945 was both a conquered territory and a moral landscape. The U.S. Army had liberated concentration camps in Buchenwald, Dachau, and elsewhere. Soldiers witnessed evidence of systematic atrocity. Many carried anger and grief. Official directives emphasized that Germany had initiated aggressive war and committed crimes against humanity. The purpose of occupation was not merely administrative. It was corrective. Yet the American military also framed its mission in moral terms. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and later President Harry Truman described the war as a defense of democratic principles. Army chaplains reinforced these themes in sermons delivered to U.S. units across Europe. Soldiers were reminded that they represented not only military power, but national values. Within this framework, religious life held particular significance. American forces included thousands of chaplains from Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish backgrounds. They conducted services near front lines, in temporary tents, and later in occupied towns. Their presence signaled continuity between battlefield and home front faith traditions. When American civilians, aid workers, Red Cross personnel, and later relief administrators entered the occupation zone, they carried similar motivations. Humanitarian aid was not framed as sympathy for Nazism. It was framed as prevention of suffering and instability. Inviting German civilians, including women, to attend structured religious services served multiple purposes. It demonstrated discipline. It modeled American religious freedom. It subtly communicated that occupation did not mean eradication of spiritual life. For many American soldiers, sitting in a German church required its own adjustment. Some had lost friends in combat only weeks earlier. Others had family members still fighting in the Pacific. The memory of war crimes was fresh, but policy and faith intersected in a way that encouraged restraint. The act of sharing a sanctuary, even without direct conversation, carried a message. The war had ended militarily. The work of reconstruction had begun. By 1945, much of Germany's political infrastructure lay in ruins. Nazi party offices were shuttered. Government records were seized. Civic leadership was suspended pending denazification investigations. Churches, however, retained a form of continuity. Both Catholic and Protestant institutions had complex relationships with the Nazi regime. Some clergy had resisted openly. Others had complied. After surrender, Allied authorities evaluated religious leaders individually. Many were permitted to remain in their roles, provided they were not active party functionaries. As a result, churches became among the first semi-stable meeting spaces in occupied towns. Architecturally, they were often among the few large buildings still usable. Socially, they offered familiarity in a time of upheaval. Spiritually, they provided language for grief and repentance. American military government officers recognized this. They allowed services to resume quickly under supervision. Sermons were monitored in early months to prevent nationalist rhetoric. Gradually, oversight loosened. Within these sanctuaries, practical cooperation emerged. Church kitchens distributed soup. Parish lists helped identify widows and orphans in need. Baptisms and funerals resumed. The rhythms of life restarted quietly. When American chaplains attended or coordinated with local clergy, the setting reduced tension. It was neither a courtroom nor a command post. It was not a site of interrogation. It was a place structured around ritual and order. 4 German women, many of whom were now heads of households in the absence of husbands. The church represented stability. To receive an invitation in that space was less threatening than a summons to a government office. The neutrality of the church did not erase the power imbalance of occupation. American soldiers remained armed. Curfews remained enforced. But inside those walls, hierarchy softened. What began as administrative coordination gradually took on symbolic meaning. And that symbolism would deepen as policy shifted and contact increased. September 1945. The formal document was brief. The implications were not. After months of field reports and internal review, the United States Army officially relaxed its non-fraternization policy in Germany. The order, first imposed in 1944 and reinforced during the final offensives, had prohibited friendly contact between American soldiers and German civilians. Now, occupation authorities acknowledged what reality had already demonstrated. Rigid separation was neither practical nor strategically beneficial. The revision did not permit unrestricted interaction. Marriage still required authorization. Conduct standards remained strict. But conversation, attendance at public events, and limited social contact were no longer forbidden. For towns across the American zone, this administrative change quietly altered the atmosphere. In Bavaria, in Hesse, in Württemberg-Baden, military government detachments communicated the updated guidance to local commanders. Chaplains received clarification. Civic leaders were informed. Church officials, already cooperating in relief coordination, understood that joint presence would no longer violate standing orders. The first services reflecting this shift were not dramatic ceremonies. They were ordinary Sundays. In cities such as Frankfurt, Nuremberg, and smaller Bavarian towns, less documented in headlines, but preserved in local records, American chaplains attended Protestant and Catholic services not as silent overseers, but as recognized participants. In some instances, brief remarks were delivered, translated carefully, emphasizing peace, reconstruction, and responsibility. German clergy, many of whom had navigated a precarious relationship with the Nazi regime, now faced a different task. They preached repentance without humiliation. They acknowledged defeat without surrendering dignity. Their congregations, heavily composed of women, listened in silence that carried both grief and relief. Outside these churches, American military police maintained order as usual. Occupation authority had not softened. War crimes investigations continued. Denazification questionnaires were distributed. Former party members were classified and reviewed. Yet inside the sanctuaries, a new visual reality emerged. American uniforms among wooden pews. German women seated beside them. not as equals in political status, but as civilians no longer treated as untouchable adversaries. Contemporary reports from U.S. Army Chaplain Corps archives note the importance of these early encounters. Chaplains described German congregations as subdued but attentive. They observed that attendance was high, especially among women and elderly parishioners. Some accounts emphasize the quietness of the moment, the absence of overt hostility. The significance lay not in overt emotion, but in restraint. For German women who had prepared for exclusion or retribution, the normalization of shared worship challenged deeply embedded fears. The American presence did not intrude upon ritual. Soldiers removed helmets. They stood during hymns. They bowed their heads in prayer. This behavior was not accidental. Military leadership understood the symbolic dimension of occupation. Public conduct reflected national values. Discipline was strategic. By late autumn 1945, similar patterns appeared across multiple districts. Thanksgiving services organized by American units sometimes included invitations to local German clergy or congregants. Christmas approached under new conditions. The first December without Nazi banners, without wartime blackout restrictions in many towns, without propaganda loudspeakers. The winter of 1945 to 46 would be harsh. Coal shortages and food rationing created severe hardship. Yet even amid scarcity, church attendance remained strong. Religious observance provided continuity in a landscape of uncertainty. The turning point was not marked by applause or proclamation. It was marked by repetition. Each Sunday that Americans and Germans occupied the same sacred space without incident weakened the psychological boundary that war had built. Each invitation extended and accepted reinforced the message that occupation sought stability, not annihilation. At the same time, legal reckoning unfolded in parallel. In November 1945, the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg began prosecuting leading Nazi officials. The trials underscored that accountability was directed at architects of the regime, not indiscriminately at civilians. This distinction became clearer over time. The women sitting in those churches were not on trial. They were navigating survival in a defeated nation. The Americans present were not there as conquerors in triumph, but as administrators overseeing transition. By early 1946, the atmosphere in many Western towns had shifted from shock to cautious adaptation. The decisive change had occurred quietly. The enemy had become a neighbor under supervision. And as winter deepened, that fragile coexistence would be tested and strengthened by the realities of daily life. The winter of 1945 to 1946 was one of the coldest in recent European memory. Coal production had collapsed. Rail lines were damaged. Urban housing stock was shattered from bombing. In many German cities, indoor temperatures fell near freezing. Food rations dropped to subsistence levels, sometimes below 1,200 calories per day. Malnutrition increased, particularly among children and the elderly. Occupation authorities faced a strategic dilemma. A starving population could destabilize the fragile order that had been established. Black markets were already expanding. Displaced persons camps required constant supply. Public health concerns grew as sanitation systems struggled. Within this environment, churches assumed even greater importance. Soup kitchens operated in parish halls. Clothing drives were organized. American military government units coordinated with clergy to distribute surplus rations when possible. U.S. Army chaplains reported not only on morale among troops, but on civilian conditions observed during services. It was during this winter that shared religious space took on deeper meaning. The war crimes trials at Nuremberg were underway, only miles from some of the towns where these services occurred. Evidence of atrocities filled international headlines. Photographs of concentration camps circulated globally. German civilians confronted images many claimed they had never seen before. For women attending church in early 1946, the moral landscape had shifted again. They lived in a defeated nation. They faced material deprivation. They listened to sermons that increasingly addressed guilt, responsibility, and the need for renewal. Outside, American patrols continued routine oversight. Inside, American chaplains sometimes spoke of justice and reconciliation in measured tones. The coexistence of these realities, the prosecution of high-ranking Nazi leaders and the invitation of ordinary civilians into shared worship, defined the turning point. Occupation was no longer defined solely by military victory. It was defined by structured accountability paired with controlled reintegration. Reports from U.S. Army Civil Affairs offices during early 1946 note a gradual softening of civilian demeanor in many Western zones. Hostility diminished. Compliance increased. Attendance at public meetings stabilized. German municipal administrators, vetted through denazification, began resuming limited responsibilities. In church records from several Bavarian and Hessian towns, entries from this period mention American participation during holiday services. Christmas 1945 had already marked a symbolic transition, the first holiday observed without Nazi symbolism. Easter 1946 reinforced it. Themes of resurrection and rebuilding resonated strongly in congregations composed largely of women who had endured years of total war. There were no dramatic scenes of collective reconciliation. No single sermon transformed public consciousness. Instead, repetition solidified change. An American soldier standing respectfully during a hymn became less remarkable. A German mother allowing her child to accept candy from a uniformed chaplain became less controversial. Shared observance normalized proximity. At the same time, the U.S. Army began preparing for longer-term restructuring of Germany's western zones. Discussions that would eventually lead to the BWII, the economic merger of American and British zones in 1947, were already forming. Stabilization required cooperation. Cooperation required minimal trust. Trust did not emerge from policy alone. It emerged from consistent behavior. The invitation to church, initially met with disbelief, became, over months, an ordinary feature of post-war life. Not universal, not uniform across every district, but present enough to reshape perception. By mid-1946, fraternization regulations had been further relaxed. Formal social gatherings, cultural events, and educational exchanges increased cautiously. Marriages between American servicemen and German women, though regulated, became more common. Each application required background investigation and command approval, reinforcing that the shift was controlled rather than spontaneous. The decisive transformation was psychological. In April 1945, American troops had entered as armed conquerors in the eyes of a fearful civilian population. By early 1946, in many towns, they were viewed as administrators and sometimes as participants in communal rituals. The rubble had not disappeared. The trials at Nuremberg continued. Germany remained divided into occupation zones. Yet the emotional distance between occupier and occupied had narrowed. And from that narrowing distance would grow the political and cultural realignments that defined the second half of the 20th century. By mid-1946, the American occupation zone was no longer defined solely by surrender. It was defined by reconstruction. Military government detachments transitioned from emergency stabilization to institutional reform. German municipal administrations were gradually reconstituted under Allied supervision. Former Nazi officials were removed through denazification tribunals, categorized into classifications ranging from major offender to exonerated. The process was imperfect and often inconsistent, but it signaled a fundamental shift. Responsibility would be individualized, not collectively imposed. For German women, this administrative transformation altered daily life. They were no longer navigating only survival under military curfew. They were participating cautiously in the rebuilding of civic structures. Women serve as clerks in local offices, teachers in reopened schools, volunteers in parish aid networks. The absence of large numbers of men meant that women's civic presence remained highly visible. Religious institutions continued to function as stabilizing centers. In the American zone, both Protestant and Catholic churches regained operational autonomy under democratic safeguards. Sermons increasingly addressed moral accountability, reconciliation, and social responsibility rather than nationalist rhetoric. Clergy encouraged participation in local governance and charitable work. American occupation authorities recognized the influence of these institutions. Rather than suppress them, policy encouraged their role in promoting democratic values. Chaplain reports from 1946 and 1947 often describe collaboration with German pastors in youth programs and community rebuilding initiatives. Parallel to moral reconstruction came economic intervention. In 1947, the United States announced the European Recovery Program, later known as the Marshall Plan. Though its full impact would unfold over years, its psychological effect was immediate. Aid shipments of food, machinery, and raw materials began reaching Western Germany. Infrastructure repair accelerated. Industrial production, once tightly restricted, gradually resumed under Allied oversight. The American zone merged economically with the British zone in January 1947, forming the BWII. This administrative consolidation signaled that Western Germany would not remain indefinitely in suspended status. A new political future was taking shape. Within towns where shared church attendance had begun tentatively in 1945, the atmosphere continued to evolve. By 1947, American soldiers were less transient occupiers and more semi-permanent fixtures. Some had returned home, replaced by occupation troops assigned longer tours. Civilian administrators and aid workers expanded their presence. Cultural exchanges, educational programs, and public discussions increased. Marriages between American servicemen and German women, once tightly restricted, grew more common after congressional legislation in the United States eased immigration barriers for war brides. Between 1945 and the early 1950s, tens of thousands of German women emigrated to the United States as spouses of American soldiers. Each marriage represented a personal decision shaped by individual circumstances. But collectively, they symbolized a broader transformation. Relationships that would have been unthinkable during wartime were now legally recognized. The church services of 1945 had not caused this shift directly, yet they had helped normalize proximity. They had demonstrated that disciplined coexistence was possible. They had offered early evidence that the American occupation sought reform rather than eradication. Still, Reconstruction remained fragile. The winter of 1946 to 47 brought renewed hardship. Political tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union intensified, foreshadowing the emerging Cold War. Berlin would soon become a focal point of confrontation. In this changing geopolitical landscape, Western Germany's stability became strategically vital, and the foundation of that stability rested not only on policy and economic aid, but on the gradual human redefinition of former enemies. By the late 1940s, the American occupation zone had evolved from a space of military control to a society cautiously navigating recovery, justice, and the beginnings of reconciliation. German civilians, especially women who had endured years of conflict and deprivation, were central to this transition. They were the primary agents of domestic stability, feeding families, maintaining households, and participating in local governance and community programs. Religious institutions continued to play a pivotal role. Churches, once silent or politicized under the Nazi regime, now functioned as venues for structured interaction. Sermons emphasized moral responsibility, social duty, and the importance of rebuilding communities. Attendance remained largely female, reflecting both demographic reality and continuity with pre-war practice. For many German women, the presence of American chaplains and soldiers in these spaces became normalized, even accepted. The initial shock at being invited to participate, once unthinkable, gradually gave way to cautious recognition of shared humanity. Cultural shifts extended beyond the walls of churches. Educational programs introduced by American civil affairs units encouraged democratic thinking. Libraries and schools reopened, emphasizing civic responsibility, historical awareness, and the value of pluralism. Newspapers began circulating under Allied oversight, fostering informed public discourse. These efforts helped cultivate a societal framework in which past hostilities could be reconciled with future cooperation. Marriage and personal relationships offered another measure of change. By 1948, war bride migration was well underway. Tens of thousands of German women legally married American soldiers and relocated to the United States. These unions, while regulated, symbolized both practical and emotional bridges between former enemies. They demonstrated that human bonds could form despite the enormity of wartime divisions. In parallel, Germany's geopolitical orientation shifted. The Western zones gradually consolidated, first as the Bis I and later as the Tri-Zone with the inclusion of the French zone, paving the way for the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949. American-led economic and administrative policies laid the groundwork for stability. Reconstruction, legal reform, and civic engagement fostered confidence that Germany could function as a democratic partner in a post-war Europe. Oral histories, diaries, and memoirs from German women who had attended early church services in 1945 to 46 underscore the psychological significance of these experiences. Many recalled a mix of disbelief and cautious relief upon encountering disciplined, courteous Americans in sacred spaces. These memories were preserved in local archives and family records, illustrating that reconciliation began at the personal, daily level long before treaties or international agreements were formalized. By 1950, the cumulative impact of these policies and interactions had reshaped perceptions on both sides. Americans had demonstrated that occupation could coexist with moral restraint, while Germans, especially women in civilian and domestic roles, recognized that collaboration and compliance could coexist with dignity. Shared participation in religious, cultural, and civic life became a model for broader societal normalization. The American zone's experience provided valuable lessons for post-conflict engagement. Practical needs, moral conduct, and structured human interaction were as vital to lasting stability as military victory or legal enforcement. The simple act of inviting civilians into shared spaces, particularly sacred spaces, proved to be a powerful catalyst for rebuilding trust and initiating the slow process of reconciliation. This period of occupation laid the foundations not only for West Germany's political and economic recovery, but also for enduring transatlantic relationships. Churches, once venues of surprise and cautious disbelief, became symbols of early cooperation. The humility, restraint, and consistency displayed by American authorities created conditions in which former enemies could begin to perceive one another as fellow human beings rather than solely as adversaries. The experiences of German women who entered those first post-war church services exemplify a broader truth of history. Reconciliation is incremental, often quiet, and rooted in ordinary acts of trust and shared routine. While political treaties and economic plans shaped the larger trajectory, human engagement at the personal and communal level created the psychological space necessary for durable peace. The story of German women attending church alongside American personnel in 1945 to 46 is a quiet testament to the subtle power of human contact after war. It was not marked by grand speeches, military parades, or political declarations. It was marked by restraint, ritual, and the repeated small acts that signaled a shift from fear to cautious trust. For these women, the invitation to enter a sanctuary where the enemy stood was initially met with disbelief. Years of propaganda, deprivation, and social upheaval had prepared them to expect humiliation or violence. Yet, within the walls of the church, American soldiers and chaplains conducted themselves with discipline, respect, and a shared acknowledgement of common humanity. The moment itself, simple, unadorned, and deeply human, challenged assumptions broke the rhythm of fear and planted seeds for reconciliation. From a broader historical perspective, this episode illustrates a fundamental truth about post-conflict societies. Rebuilding structures and enforcing laws is necessary, but insufficient. Peace is forged not only through policy, courts, and treaties, but through the mundane, repeated acts that restore human dignity. Shared spaces, whether a church, a school, or a town hall, create opportunities for former adversaries to recognize one another as people, not merely as symbols of a defeated enemy. The psychological impact of these early encounters extended far beyond the pews. They shaped attitudes, informed future civilian-military interactions, and laid the groundwork for broader social integration, including marriages, civic participation, and cross-cultural exchange. Over time, these cumulative experiences contributed to the stabilization of the American occupation zone, the democratic reconstruction of West Germany, and the eventual transatlantic partnerships that would define the second half of the 20th century. History often remembers battles, treaties, and political milestones. Yet sometimes, the most enduring transformations begin in quiet moments of human connection. The women who hesitated at the church door in 1945 exemplify this truth, that reconciliation, respect, and the slow rebuilding of trust can begin with nothing more than an open door, a shared ritual, and the disciplined presence of those once regarded as the enemy. And in that space, between fear and understanding, between defeat and dignity, the foundations of lasting peace were quietly laid.